Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a question that has floated around history classrooms, documentaries, and slightly overconfident men at parties for generations. Were the Vikings actually the first Europeans to reach America? And if they were, how exactly did a group of cold, stubborn Scandinavians in wooden boats accidentally drift across the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus showed up looking confused and underprepared? So dim the lights a little. Maybe grab a blanket. Perhaps imagine yourself sitting beside a smoky fire in a drafty Norse longhouse while somebody quietly carves a spoon for absolutely no reason. Outside, icy wind rattles the walls. Somewhere nearby, a goat is making deeply unsettling eye contact. And tonight, we're going to slowly drift across the North Atlantic together. Not quickly, of course. The Vikings did very little quickly once they left Scandinavia. Their entire exploration strategy often amounted to keep sailing west until something happens, which, surprisingly, worked far more often than it should have. Now, when most people picture Vikings, they imagine giant bearded warriors screaming while swinging axes around like emotionally unstable lumberjacks. And yes, some of that certainly happened. But Vikings were also traders, farmers, explorers, shipbuilders, poets, and professional complainers about weather. Mostly weather, because Scandinavia was cold. Not magical storybook cold. Real cold. Wet cold. The kind of cold where your socks never truly recover. And by the late 8th century, people from what we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had begun spreading outward across Europe in search of wealth, land, and opportunities to inconvenience monks. The monks, unfortunately, were having a terrible time. The Viking Age officially begins, according to historians, with the raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, which must have been an unpleasant surprise for everyone involved. Imagine quietly copying religious manuscripts all day, only to look up and see a dragon-headed ship pulling into shore full of damp Scandinavian men carrying axes. A difficult morning, but over time, Viking expansion became about much more than raiding. They settled places. They traded goods from the Middle East to the Arctic. They founded cities. They navigated enormous distances without modern maps because apparently sleep deprivation and confidence were enough. And eventually, some of them started moving westward into the Atlantic. First came islands like the Faroe Islands, then Iceland. Now Iceland is one of those places that sounds romantic today. Peaceful volcanic landscapes, northern lights, cozy sweaters, beautiful horses standing dramatically in fog. But arriving there in the 9th century was less charming. The first Norse settlers found a harsh volcanic island with freezing winters and limited farmland. Naturally, they looked around and said, yes, this seems reasonable. One of the most famous settlers was Ingolfur Arnarson, who is traditionally considered the founder of Reykjavik. According to legend, he threw wooden pillars into the sea and decided to settle wherever they washed ashore, which honestly feels less like navigation and more like outsourcing your life decisions to driftwood. Still, Iceland slowly developed into a functioning Norse society. Farmers raised sheep and cattle. Chieftains argued endlessly. Sagas were told around fires during winters that probably lasted emotionally longer than physically. And from Iceland, ambitious explorers began pushing even farther west. This brings us to one of history's great troublemakers.
Eric the Red.
A man whose nickname immediately suggests excellent anger management skills. Eric was born in Norway, but his father had been exiled for killing someone, which, unfortunately, became a bit of a family tradition. Eric himself was later exiled from Iceland for also killing people. Of course he was. The medieval Norse world handled conflict with remarkable consistency. If arguments escalated enough, somebody got hit with an axe, and then a legal assembly spent 6 hours debating whether that was technically rude. So Eric the Red found himself banished from Iceland around the year 982. And since sitting quietly and reflecting on his choices did not seem appealing, he decided to sail west into unknown waters. There, he encountered a massive icy landmass, Greenland. Now, Greenland is famously not very green, which makes its name one of history's greatest real estate scams. Eric reportedly named it Greenland because he thought people would be more willing to settle there if the name sounded pleasant, which means medieval Viking colonization already understood marketing. And honestly, fair enough. Northern frozen misery rock probably would not have attracted many settlers. So Eric returned to Iceland after his exile ended and enthusiastically promoted Greenland as a land of opportunity. Rich farmland, great prospects, totally manageable climate. Definitely not horrifying. Soon, settlers followed him. And somehow, against all odds, Norse colonies actually survived there for centuries. Imagine the sheer stubbornness required for this. These settlers lived at the edge of the known world. They raised livestock in brutally short growing seasons. They built churches. They traded walrus ivory and furs with Europe. They tried very hard to pretend this was all sustainable. And during these years, rumors began circulating about lands even farther west. Stories of forests. This was especially exciting because Greenland had very few trees. And trees were important. You needed wood for houses, ships, tools, fires, basically everything. Living in Greenland without forests was like living inside a giant icy hardware shortage. According to the Icelandic Sagas, one sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson accidentally spotted unknown western lands around the year 986 after getting blown off course, which feels very Viking. Many great discoveries throughout history involve careful planning, scientific rigor, and advanced navigation. The Vikings often discovered places because weather ruined their afternoon. Bjarni apparently saw wooded coastlines, but did not actually land there. He simply returned and described what he had seen, which frustrated other Norse explorers immensely. Because imagine hearing about giant forests across the ocean and then learning the guy just sailed home instead of investigating. A deeply Scandinavian missed opportunity. But one person became especially interested in these stories. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, and probably the most famous Viking explorer in history. Leif was born in Iceland, raised partly in Greenland, and inherited the family tradition of wandering into dangerous situations with excessive confidence. At some point around the year 1000, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and decided to investigate these western lands himself. And now, very slowly and sleepily, we drift toward North America. Leif and his crew sailed westward from Greenland into unknown waters. Eventually, they encountered a rocky, barren land, which they called Helluland. Most historians believe this was likely Baffin Island, not exactly a tourism paradise. The name essentially means something like land of flat stones, which sounds about as enthusiastic as a one-star travel review. Then they traveled farther south to a forested region they called Markland, probably Labrador. This place interested them more because, again, trees were exciting when you came from Greenland. Imagine becoming emotionally overwhelmed by lumber. Finally, they reached a milder region with grasslands and wild grapes, which Leif called Vinland. And here we arrive at one of the great historical questions. Where exactly was Vinland? Most scholars today believe the Norse settlement site discovered at Lance Aux Meadows in modern Canada represents this Viking presence in North America. Which means yes, the Vikings really did reach the Americas centuries before Columbus. Quietly, without immediately conquering entire civilizations, and without accidentally introducing horses into every historical painting afterward. Now, Lance Aux Meadows is not some giant Viking city. It was relatively small, a temporary settlement or expedition base. Archaeologists discovered evidence of Norse-style buildings, ironworking, and unmistakably Scandinavian craftsmanship, which must have been an extraordinary moment for historians. Imagine excavating a remote site in Newfoundland and slowly realizing that actual Vikings had once stood there 1,000 years ago complaining about weather and repairing boats. The Norse presence in North America appears to have been brief, maybe only a few years, perhaps slightly longer, because although Vinland offered valuable timber and resources, it also came with serious problems. Distance for one. The North Atlantic is not exactly relaxing. Even today, it can be violent and dangerous. Crossing it in open wooden ships required astonishing skill and terrifying optimism. Then there were tensions with indigenous peoples. The Sagas refer to them as Skrælings, a Norse term that historians still debate, but which was not particularly flattering. Encounters between the Norse and local populations seem to have involved trade at times and violence at others, which sadly describes much of human history. The Norse settlements never became large or permanent. Greenland itself remained isolated and vulnerable. Supplying Vinland regularly would have been incredibly difficult. And slowly, the dream faded. The Greenland colonies survived for centuries longer, but contact with Vinland disappeared into legend. Meanwhile, Europe forgot, or at least mostly forgot, because medieval knowledge was strange like that. Information drifted in and out of memory. Sagas survived in Icelandic storytelling traditions, but many Europeans later treated them almost like myths. Then centuries passed, and eventually along came Columbus. Poor Columbus, honestly. Not because he was misunderstood. He absolutely was not. But because his legacy became permanently tangled with the fact that Vikings technically got there first, which must be annoying from a branding perspective. Imagine sailing across the Atlantic expecting eternal fame, only for historians centuries later to say, well, actually, some Norwegian guy beat you to it by 500 years. A difficult blow to the ego. Of course, Columbus's voyages had much larger global consequences. His expeditions permanently connected Europe and the Americas in ways Viking exploration never did. The Norse reached North America, But they did not fundamentally reshape world history through colonization on the same scale. Still, the Viking achievement remains extraordinary. These were medieval sailors navigating brutal oceans with remarkable precision. Their ships were masterpieces of engineering. Long, flexible, fast, and surprisingly seaworthy. Viking longships could cross open oceans, navigate shallow rivers, and land directly on beaches. They were technological marvels built by people who also thought naming a frozen wasteland Greenland counted as honesty. And perhaps that contradiction is what makes Viking history so fascinating. They were skilled yet reckless, curious yet violent, capable of beautiful poetry and horrifying raids almost simultaneously. Human beings, basically, just colder. And as we continue tonight, we'll drift deeper into the strange world of Viking exploration, medieval misunderstandings, lost colonies, and the endless debate over who truly discovered America. Because history, like the North Atlantic, is rarely calm for very long. And somewhere out there in the fog, another royal disaster is already waiting for us. So now that Leif Erikson and his crew have drifted into North America, chopped down some trees, confused local populations, and probably complained continuously about damp socks, we should gently float back eastward for a moment. Back to Greenland. Because the story of Viking America is not really about one dramatic discovery. It is about survival. Or more accurately, the increasingly questionable attempt to survive in places that nature clearly intended for seals. And Greenland was perhaps the ultimate example. When Eric the Red first encouraged settlers to move there around the late 10th century, he presented it as a rugged frontier filled with opportunity, which technically was not a lie. There absolutely was opportunity. Mostly the opportunity to freeze slowly while trying to raise cattle beside glaciers. Still, hundreds of Norse settlers followed him from Iceland. They established two primary settlements along Greenland's southwestern coast, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Now these names sound impressive, but they were not giant cities. The Eastern Settlement was actually farther south than the Western Settlement because medieval geography often behaved like a tired person assembling furniture without instructions. The colonies consisted mainly of scattered farms connected by fjords and rough sea routes. Families raised sheep, goats, and cattle. They built churches from stone and turf. They imported timber and iron from Europe whenever possible. And for a while, things worked surprisingly well. The medieval climate during this period was somewhat milder than later centuries. Historians sometimes call it the medieval warm period, though warm in Greenland remained deeply relative. Nobody was sunbathing. But conditions allowed Norse farmers to maintain grazing animals and sustain small communities. They even built churches connected to the wider Christian world, which created one of the more surreal images in medieval history. Tiny isolated Greenlandic churches standing beside icy fjords at the edge of the known world, while European bishops argued endlessly about theology thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, Greenlanders were probably just trying to stop sheep from dying in snowstorms. The Norse colonies became part of a broad Viking Atlantic network stretching from Scandinavia to Iceland to Greenland and briefly to Vinland. And this network depended heavily on ships. Everything depended on ships. Food imports, communication, iron tools, timber, religious officials, news from Europe. Every important connection arrived by sea across one of the harshest oceans on Earth, which was not ideal, because the North Atlantic is not merely cold. It is emotionally cold. The kind of cold that makes human beings question every life decision leading to that moment. Storms could appear suddenly. Icebergs drifted unpredictably. Thick fog swallowed ships whole. Navigation relied on experience, stars, memory, and what sometimes feels suspiciously close to guesswork. And yet the Vikings mastered these routes astonishingly well. Their ships were engineering masterpieces. Longships get most of the attention because they look dramatic in paintings, usually packed with shouting men and ominous ravens. But Viking cargo ships, called Nars, were equally important. Nars were broader and sturdier, built for cargo rather than raiding. They carried livestock, timber, trade goods, and settlers across immense distances. Imagine crossing the Atlantic in a wooden cargo boat while surrounded by sheep. A deeply specific nightmare. Still, these voyages connected Greenland to Europe for centuries. Greenland exported valuable walrus ivory, furs, ropes, and hides. In return, they received iron, wood, luxury items, and supplies that could not be produced locally. Walrus ivory became especially important because medieval Europe loved luxury goods. Rich nobles and churches constantly wanted decorative carvings, religious objects, chess pieces, and ornate artwork made from exotic materials. And walrus ivory, harvested in Arctic regions, became highly desirable, which meant Greenland's economy partially depended on large, dangerous marine animals with terrifying tusks. Not exactly stable long-term planning, but medieval societies rarely specialized in practical industries. Entire economies often hinged on absurdly fragile trends. Somewhere in Greenland, exhausted Norse hunters were risking death among ice floes because European aristocrats wanted slightly fancier religious decorations. History is full of these strange little connections. Now, for a while, Greenland appeared stable enough. Farms expanded. Churches multiplied. A bishopric was established at Gerar. Wealthier settlers owned cattle and hosted feasts. But beneath the surface, problems slowly accumulated. Very slowly. Sleepily slowly. The kind of historical disaster that creeps toward people over generations while everyone remains mildly optimistic. First came environmental strain. Greenland's soil was fragile. Norse farming methods, adapted from Scandinavia and Iceland, were not always ideal for Arctic conditions. Grazing animals damaged vegetation. Erosion increased. Resources became harder to sustain. Then temperatures gradually cooled. The medieval warm period faded into what historians later called the Little Ice Age. Sea ice increased. Winters lengthened. Farming became more difficult. Again, more difficult in Greenland means something serious. Imagine already living at the edge of agricultural possibility and then having the climate quietly whisper, actually, no. Cattle farming suffered badly, and cattle mattered enormously in Norse culture. To medieval Scandinavians, Cows represented status and wealth. Owning cattle meant prestige. They were symbols of stability and prosperity. Unfortunately, cows are not especially designed for Greenland. This became a recurring issue. The Norse settlers often clung stubbornly to European farming traditions even as conditions worsened. Archaeological evidence suggests they continued prioritizing cattle longer than was practical. Meanwhile, the Inuit populations living farther north possessed survival techniques far better adapted to Arctic realities. The Inuit hunted seals efficiently. They used kayaks and dog sleds. They crafted warm fur clothing suited for extreme climates. The Norse, meanwhile, sometimes appeared committed to the strategy of wear wool and hope for the best. Now, historians debate how much contact occurred between the Norse Greenlanders and Inuit groups. There may have been trade, conflict, observation, avoidance, or some combination of all four. But what remains striking is how little Norse culture adapted. They continued behaving culturally European in an environment that increasingly punished European habits. And honestly, humans do this constantly. People cling to familiar traditions long after circumstances change. Medieval Greenlanders were no different. Except their traditions involved freezing beside cows on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Meanwhile, Europe itself was changing. Trade patterns shifted. Walrus ivory became less valuable once elephant ivory sources expanded. Political instability affected shipping routes. Norway endured crises, including the Black Death. And Greenland grew increasingly isolated. Fewer ships arrived. Less iron reached the colonies. Communication weakened. Imagine living in Greenland during the 14th century, watching the occasional supply ship become rarer and rarer while winters worsened around you. A very quiet form of apocalypse. Not dramatic. Not explosive, just gradual isolation, gradual hunger, gradual uncertainty. And through it all, life continued in strangely ordinary ways. People still married. Children were born. Livestock needed feeding. Priests conducted services. Arguments happened over property and inheritance because human beings apparently remained committed to paperwork even during societal collapse. One of the most haunting details from Greenland archaeology involves clothing. The Norse settlers continued wearing European-style wool garments for centuries. Carefully tailored outfits modeled after continental fashions. This means somewhere in icy medieval Greenland, people were still trying to look stylish while surrounded by glaciers and existential dread. Very human behavior. By the 1300s and early 1400s, conditions became increasingly severe. The Western settlement vanished first. We do not know exactly what happened. Maybe starvation. Maybe migration. Maybe gradual abandonment. Medieval records mention reports that livestock had gone feral and surviving inhabitants seemed desperate. Not encouraging. The eastern settlement survived longer, but eventually disappeared too. And this is where Greenland's story becomes oddly ghost-like. The colonies simply faded away. No final dramatic battle. No enormous catastrophe. Just silence. European ships arriving later found abandoned farms and empty churches. The Norse Greenlanders had vanished from history. which naturally inspired centuries of speculation. Did they starve? Did they leave? Did they die from disease? Did they integrate with Inuit communities? Historians still debate aspects of this collapse today. Most likely, multiple factors combined slowly over time. Climate change, economic decline, isolation, environmental stress, and dwindling trade networks all contributed. The colonies became unsustainable. And somewhere inside that broader collapse, contact with Vinland disappeared entirely. Because if Greenland itself struggled to survive, maintaining distant expeditions to North America became almost impossible. Vinland faded into saga memory. Now the sagas themselves are fascinating documents. The two main texts describing Vinland voyages are the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Both were written centuries after the events they describe, based on oral traditions, which means historians approach them carefully. Medieval sagas blend history, storytelling, family pride, exaggeration, and occasional personal grudges into one complicated stew. One saga might describe a heroic explorer. Another might quietly imply he was an incompetent idiot who got lucky once. Very relatable historical writing. Still, despite inconsistencies, the sagas preserved remarkable details about Western voyages. For centuries, many scholars doubted them entirely. The idea of Vikings reaching North America sounded romantic, but unproven. Then archaeology changed everything. In the 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Stein Ingstad investigated sites in Newfoundland. And at Lance Aux Meadows, they discovered unmistakable evidence of Norse occupation. Turf buildings, ironworking remains, Norse artifacts. Proof. Actual Vikings had reached North America around the year 1000. And honestly, there is something wonderfully quiet about this discovery. The Vikings did not build massive monuments there. They left no giant empire behind, no towering ruins, just modest structures at the edge of a continent. Temporary visitors from across the sea. Perhaps that is partly why the story feels so strangely peaceful compared to later colonial histories. The Norse came, explored, traded, fought occasionally, harvested resources, and eventually left. History moved on. Indigenous peoples continued living across the Americas exactly as they had before. Europe largely forgot the voyages, and the Atlantic returned to silence for centuries. Still, the fact remains extraordinary. Long before Columbus, long before the great age of European empires, long before maps properly understood the Western Ocean, a small group of Norse sailors crossed the Atlantic in wooden ships and reached North America, not because they possessed advanced scientific institutions, not because kings funded grand expeditions, but because generations of stubborn Scandinavian explorers kept sailing farther into fog. And perhaps that is the real heart of the story. Not conquest. Not triumph, just curiosity mixed with recklessness, which, to be fair, describes a surprising amount of human history. And as we continue drifting tonight, we'll slowly move into the strange afterlife of Viking legends themselves. Because centuries later, People became absolutely obsessed with these explorers. Romantic poets adored them. Nationalists reinvented them. Victorian historians turned them into heroic symbols with extremely dramatic beards. And naturally, modern conspiracy theories eventually arrived too. Because of course they did. So the actual Viking presence in North America was brief. A few settlements, some voyages, a handful of sagas passed down through generations in Iceland while Europe mostly wandered off to fight wars, invent complicated hats, and argue about religion for several centuries. And for a long time, the Vinland stories remained half-forgotten fragments sitting quietly inside medieval manuscripts. Then the 19th century arrived, and suddenly everyone became emotionally obsessed with Vikings. This happens surprisingly often in history. One era looks back at another era and decides to reinvent it entirely according to its own fantasies. Medieval knights became symbols of chivalry long after actual knights had mostly been muddy landlords with back problems. Pirates became charming rebels instead of heavily armed sea criminals with horrifying dental hygiene. And the Vikings? The Vikings became towering romantic heroes wrapped in fur cloaks while standing dramatically on cliffs during thunderstorms. Reality, meanwhile, was usually colder and smellier. But the 19th century absolutely loved them. Part of this fascination emerged from rising nationalism across Europe. Countries increasingly searched for glorious ancient origins to build national identity. People wanted heroic ancestors, epic traditions, ancient warriors with strong cheekbones. Scandinavia happened to provide excellent material, especially because Viking history already came packaged with adventure, exploration, mythology, dragons carved into ships, and enough gloomy weather to satisfy every romantic painter in Europe. Writers and artists became enchanted by Norse sagas. Suddenly, medieval Icelandic literature was being translated and celebrated internationally. Viking characters wandered through poems, operas, paintings, and political speeches, looking very intense, and frequently shirtless despite the climate. One particularly important figure in this revival was Richard Wagner, whose operatic cycle Der Ring den Nibelungen drew heavily from Norse mythology and Germanic legends. Now Wagner himself was an extraordinarily complicated person with deeply unpleasant views and an ego large enough to require separate architectural planning. But his works helped spread romanticized images of Vikings and Norse gods across Europe. Suddenly, everybody wanted Odin, Valhalla, heroic warriors, magical swords, and dramatic doomed destinies. Quiet medieval farmers from Greenland probably would have found this confusing, because actual Viking life involved far more repairing fishing nets and arguing about livestock than standing heroically beside volcanoes. But myths rarely care about realism. Victorian artists especially adored the aesthetic possibilities. Paintings showed impossibly handsome Vikings gazing nobly across stormy seas. Their ships looked immaculate. Their beards flowed majestically in the wind. Real Viking voyages, meanwhile, probably smelled like wet wool and anxiety. Still, the image spread everywhere. And interestingly, this romantic Viking revival strongly influenced ideas about the discovery of America, because by the 19th century, scholars were increasingly taking the Vinland Sagas seriously. Evidence remained incomplete at the time, but many historians believed the Norse stories contained genuine historical truth. Viking America slowly entered public imagination, which created a fascinating cultural rivalry. Because now people could debate whether Christopher Columbus truly discovered America or whether Leif Erikson deserved the title instead. And this debate became surprisingly emotional, particularly in the United States, because America during the 19th century was filled with immigrant communities from across Europe, all eager to celebrate their heritage and contribute heroic ancestors to national mythology. Scandinavian immigrants especially embraced Leif Erikson as a symbol of Nordic exploration and achievement, which makes sense. If your cultural ancestors reached North America centuries before Columbus, you absolutely mention it whenever possible. Soon statues of Leif Erikson appeared in American cities. Books praised Viking courage and seamanship. Speeches celebrated Norse democratic traditions. Some people became slightly too enthusiastic. And by slightly, I mean there were moments when amateur historians essentially convinced themselves Vikings had reached almost every corner of North America. Minnesota? Vikings. Massachusetts? Probably Vikings. Random suspicious rock somewhere in the woods? Definitely Vikings. At one point, people treated nearly every mysterious carving or unusual stone as possible evidence of Norse explorers. Because once historical excitement takes hold, restraint quietly leaves the room. One famous example is the Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in 1898. According to the stone's inscription, Scandinavian explorers supposedly traveled deep into North America during the 14th century, which would be extraordinary. Unfortunately, most scholars believe the runestone is a hoax. A very committed hoax, admittedly, but still probably fake. The 19th century produced many such discoveries because people desperately wanted physical proof of Viking exploration beyond Newfoundland. And honestly, the desire is understandable. There is something irresistibly compelling about the image of Vikings wandering through North America centuries before Columbus. It feels cinematic. Cold northern explorers drifting into unknown lands beneath gray skies while carrying axes and unresolved emotional issues. Meanwhile, poor Columbus gradually became trapped in historical arguments he could no longer defend himself against. Again, not because Columbus was historically innocent, far from it, but because his symbolic role became increasingly awkward. For centuries, European and American narratives treated Columbus as the singular heroic discoverer of the New World. Schools celebrated him. Cities honored him. Holidays emerged around his voyages. Then, historians slowly started complicating the story. First, indigenous peoples had obviously inhabited the Americas for thousands of years already, which made the word discovery rather questionable from their perspective. And second, Vikings had apparently reached North America centuries earlier anyway. So Columbus lost his status as both first and heroic simultaneously. A rough historical downgrade. But this shift also reflected broader changes in how people understood history itself. Older historical writing often focused heavily on singular great men accomplishing dramatic feats. By contrast, modern historians increasingly emphasize larger systems, cultural interactions, and long-term processes. which means the story of Viking America became less about one heroic explorer and more about networks. Migration networks, trade networks, climate patterns, cultural adaptation, shipbuilding traditions, generations of accumulated navigational knowledge, all the quiet background structures that make exploration possible. And really, Viking expansion across the North Atlantic was astonishing. Think about the distances involved. From Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Greenland to Newfoundland. These were not accidental little coastal trips. They required advanced maritime skills passed carefully across generations. The Vikings understood currents, winds, seasons, and ship construction with remarkable sophistication. Now, they did not possess modern navigational instruments. No GPS. No accurate longitude calculations. No weather forecasts politely warning them about incoming disasters. Instead, sailors relied on memory, landmarks, stars, sun position, bird movements, and possibly navigational sunstones described in later traditions, which sounds magical, but was likely practical. Some crystals can help detect polarized sunlight even through clouds. Historians still debate exactly how Vikings navigated, but whatever methods they used clearly worked extraordinarily well. At least often enough. Occasionally, they also got catastrophically lost, which is important to acknowledge. But medieval exploration generally involved a lot of "we might die horribly" energy. Now, while 19th century romantics focused on heroic exploration, they often ignored less glamorous realities of Viking society, like slavery. Viking economies depended significantly on enslaved labor. Raids frequently targeted captives alongside treasure. Human trafficking formed a major part of Norse commerce, which tends to disappear from overly romantic paintings. Similarly, Viking societies could be deeply violent and hierarchical despite occasional modern attempts to portray them as perfectly egalitarian adventurers who spent weekends appreciating nature. History rarely offers pure heroes. Instead, it provides complicated people shaped by harsh environments, economic pressures, cultural values, and very questionable hygiene. Still, the fascination persisted, partly because Vikings embodied something emotionally appealing to industrial-era Europeans and Americans. Freedom, movement, adventure, the open sea. By the 19th century, modern industrial society increasingly felt crowded and regulated. Cities expanded rapidly. Factories transformed daily life. Bureaucracy spread everywhere like damp wallpaper. And into this world stepped the romantic Viking image. Wild. Independent. Untamed. Though again, actual Viking farmers probably spent most of their lives anxiously monitoring hay supplies. But myths simplify things. They flatten complexity into symbols people can emotionally hold on to. And nowhere did this become stranger than 20th century politics, because eventually various nationalist movements began appropriating Viking imagery for ideological purposes. Some groups treated Norse heritage as evidence of supposed racial superiority, which was historically absurd but unfortunately influential. The Nazis especially misused Germanic and Norse symbolism extensively. They transformed complex medieval cultures into propaganda tools for racist ideology, which deeply damaged public understanding of Viking history for generations afterward. Modern historians have worked carefully to dismantle these distortions. Actual Viking societies were far more connected, diverse, and globally engaged than nationalist myths suggested. Vikings traded across enormous distances, reaching the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Their societies evolved constantly through contact and exchange. They were not isolated, pure northern superhumans. They were people. Messy, adaptable, violent, curious people. And honestly, one of the most comforting things about history is realizing that humans have always been complicated. Even the legendary explorers. Even the famous kings. Even the supposedly fearless Vikings crossing the Atlantic probably spent half their voyages seasick and regretting everything. Now, while historians debated the meaning of Vinland and 19th century artists painted heroic Scandinavians staring intensely into fog, archaeology continued slowly uncovering new evidence. And eventually the discoveries at Lance aux Meadows finally settled the biggest question. Yes, the Norse reached North America. No longer legend. No longer nationalist fantasy. Reality. Though perhaps quieter and stranger than people expected. Because the truth was not a massive lost Viking empire stretching across America. It was smaller, more fragile, a temporary foothold at the edge of an enormous unknown continent, which somehow makes it feel even more human. A few ships crossing cold seas. A few buildings raised against Atlantic winds. A few years of exploration before distance and hardship pulled everything apart again. And somewhere beyond those lonely settlements, vast indigenous civilizations continued thriving across the Americas, entirely unaware that future centuries would obsess endlessly over which Europeans technically arrived first. History has a strange sense of proportion sometimes. And as we continue tonight, we'll drift deeper into the actual daily lives of Viking explorers themselves. What they ate, how they slept, why their ships worked so well, why medieval Icelandic family feuds became almost comically intense, and why nearly every important Viking saga eventually circles back to somebody getting exiled after an argument that escalated far too quickly. Because of course it does. So, before we continue drifting farther across the Atlantic, let's slow down for a moment and spend some time with the actual Vikings themselves. Not the opera Vikings. Not the movie Vikings standing shirtless in snow while orchestral music swells dramatically behind them. Real Vikings. Cold Vikings. Tired Vikings. People whose daily lives involved fish, mud, smoke, wet wood, and endless arguments over property boundaries. Because the truth is that exploration rarely feels glamorous while it is happening. Most explorers spend far more time fixing equipment and worrying about food than heroically discovering continents. And Viking explorers were no exception. Now, first, we should probably address one of the biggest misconceptions immediately. The helmets. No, Vikings did not wear horned helmets into battle. Those famous horned helmets were mostly invented by 19th century costume designers and artists who apparently looked at practical combat gear and thought, you know what this needs? Large decorative handles. Real Viking helmets were much simpler. Iron caps designed for protection, not theatrical performance. Because if you are fighting somebody with an axe, adding giant horns simply gives your enemy extra surfaces to grab. Not ideal. Still, the image persisted because humans love dramatic nonsense. And honestly, the 19th century gave almost everybody unnecessary horns at some point. Now, daily Viking life depended heavily on geography and season. In places like Norway, communities clustered around fjords and coastal regions where farming was possible. Summers were short but productive. Winters were long, dark, and emotionally demanding. Homes called longhouses formed the center of family life. These buildings were large rectangular structures built from timber, turf, or stone depending on local resources. Entire families lived together inside alongside servants, animals, tools, and smoke from central fires, which sounds cozy in theory. In practice, it was probably loud, crowded, and permanently scented like damp sheep. Imagine trying to sleep while livestock shuffled nearby and smoke drifted slowly around the ceiling because medieval ventilation remained more of a hopeful suggestion than an engineering reality. Still, longhouses served as social centers. People cooked, repaired clothing, carved tools, shared stories, and endured winter darkness together. And winter darkness in Scandinavia is no small thing. During northern winters, daylight shrinks dramatically. In Greenland and Iceland especially, long stretches of cold darkness shaped everyday psychology. Storytelling became essential entertainment. This is partly why Norse sagas matter so much. The sagas preserved history, family memory, humor, law, and social values through storytelling traditions. People gathered around fires listening to tales of voyages, feuds, ghosts, outlaw heroes, unlucky marriages, and occasionally extremely petty revenge. Honestly, medieval Icelandic literature can feel startlingly modern sometimes. Characters complain constantly. Families hold grudges for generations. Awkward social interactions spiral into murder with astonishing efficiency. And everyone speaks with the calm emotional restraint of people trying very hard not to admit they are furious. One of the funniest recurring patterns in the sagas is how casually life-changing violence emerges from minor disagreements. Somebody insults another man's horse. Another person makes a sarcastic comment during dinner. Suddenly, two extended families are legally obligated to ruin each other's lives for 40 years. Medieval Iceland was exhausting. Now, Viking societies were not unified kingdoms in the modern sense during much of the Viking Age. Political power remained fragmented among local chieftains, regional kings, assemblies, and family alliances, which meant social reputation mattered enormously. Honor shaped everything. A person standing within the community determined legal influence, marriage prospects, trade relationships, and survival itself. This created cultures intensely sensitive to insults and public shame. Again, exhausting. Imagine living in a society where one poorly phrased joke at dinner might eventually lead to several burned farmhouses and 3 generations of litigation. And yet these same societies also produced remarkable systems of law. In Iceland especially, the Alþingi developed as one of Europe's oldest parliamentary assemblies. Chieftains and free men gathered annually to settle disputes, arrange marriages, negotiate alliances, and recite laws from memory. Because writing everything down consistently was apparently less appealing than trusting one very stressed individual to memorize legal codes. Still, it worked surprisingly well. Most of the time. Now, alongside farming and politics, ships formed the true heart of Viking civilization. Everything revolved around the sea.
Trade,
Raiding, fishing, exploration, communication. Without ships, Viking expansion across the Atlantic could never have happened. And Viking shipbuilders were astonishingly skilled craftsmen. Longships used clinker-built construction, where overlapping wooden planks created flexible but durable hulls. This flexibility mattered enormously in rough seas because ships could bend with waves rather than snap rigidly against them. The vessels were lightweight, fast, and shallow enough to navigate rivers and coastlines, which unfortunately made them excellent for surprise raids. Monks across Europe eventually learned to fear dragon-shaped silhouettes appearing through coastal fog, a difficult association. But Viking ships also carried merchants, settlers, explorers, and families. The same technology enabling raids also connected enormous trade networks stretching from North America to the Middle East. That duality appears constantly in Viking history. Beautiful craftsmanship alongside brutal violence. Poetry beside slavery. Exploration mixed with destruction. Human complexities sailing around in wooden boats. Now voyages across the North Atlantic required extraordinary preparation. A trip from Greenland to Vinland was not some casual weekend excursion. Crews needed food supplies, tools, repair materials, livestock in some cases, and immense navigational experience. Timing mattered carefully because Atlantic weather shifted seasonally. And despite modern romantic depictions, these voyages were probably deeply uncomfortable. Ships crowded with people, cargo, and animals. Salt spray everywhere. Freezing rain. Minimal privacy. Constant dampness. The Atlantic working tirelessly to destroy morale. Even sleeping aboard ship was difficult. Crews often sheltered under wool cloaks or simple coverings while waves slammed against wooden hulls throughout the night. And seasickness remained universal because nature enjoys humiliating human ambition whenever possible. Still, Viking sailors developed impressive navigational knowledge. They observed currents, bird migrations, whale behavior, cloud formations, and the color of seawater. Experienced navigators memorized routes across enormous distances. Some historians believe Vikings may have used sunstones, special crystals capable of detecting polarized sunlight through clouds, which sounds wonderfully mystical. And perhaps somewhere a very serious Norse navigator dramatically held up a glowing crystal while younger sailors nodded respectfully. Though, realistically, much navigation probably involved generations of accumulated practical experience, mixed with educated guessing. Because even the greatest medieval sailors occasionally ended up very lost. This brings us back to the Vinland voyages themselves. According to the Sagas, Leif Erikson's expedition found resources Greenland desperately needed. Timber especially. Forests in Vinland must have seemed almost magical after Greenland's scarcity. Imagine entire landscapes full of trees instead of endless rock and ice. Norse crews harvested lumber, explored coastlines, and established temporary camps. Some sagas also describe wild grapes or berries, which inspired the name Vinland. Though historians still debate whether Vin referred specifically to grapes, pastureland, or something else entirely. Medieval language enjoys creating arguments for future academics. Now, one particularly fascinating detail from the sagas involves encounters with indigenous peoples. The Norse described local populations as skrælings. The exact meaning remains debated, though it was probably not complimentary. At times, trade occurred peacefully. The sagas describe exchanges of goods including animal pelts and dairy products. One famous account mentions indigenous people being frightened by the sound of a bull brought by the Norse settlers, which honestly must have been an extremely strange first contact experience for everyone involved. Imagine living your entire life without cattle and suddenly encountering one unexpectedly in Newfoundland. A very confusing afternoon. But tensions eventually escalated. The Norse settlements remained tiny and vulnerable. Indigenous populations vastly outnumbered them. Violent conflicts appear in the sagas, though details are uncertain and heavily shaped by Norse perspectives. Ultimately, the Vinland settlements failed to become permanent. And honestly, this outcome makes sense. Distance alone posed enormous challenges. Maintaining regular Atlantic voyages between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland stretched resources thin. Greenland itself already existed near the edge of sustainable settlement. Adding another colony beyond that became increasingly impractical, especially once climate conditions worsened. Still, for a brief period around the year 1000, Norse explorers established a European foothold in North America, a remarkable achievement accomplished without modern navigation, centralized empires, or advanced scientific institutions. Just ships, skill, and generations of accumulated maritime knowledge. Now, while explorers crossed oceans, everyday Viking society back home continued operating through farming, trade, and deeply complicated family politics. Marriage alliances mattered enormously. Elite families carefully arranged unions to secure wealth and power. Women in Norse society often possessed somewhat stronger legal rights than in many other medieval European cultures. They could inherit property, request divorce under certain conditions, and manage farms during male absences. Though we should avoid romanticizing this too heavily. Viking society remained patriarchal and hierarchical. Freedom depended heavily on class and status. Enslaved people endured extremely harsh conditions throughout the Norse world. Still, compared to many medieval societies, Norse women sometimes exercised notable authority within households and economic life, which leads us naturally toward one of history's recurring themes. Powerful medieval women quietly holding entire societies together while men sailed around starting arguments in foreign countries. A timeless pattern. Now, religion in Viking society also changed dramatically during this period. Early Vikings followed traditional Norse pagan beliefs centered around gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. These myths reflected harsh northern environments filled with danger, fate, winter, and inevitable doom. Norse mythology is strangely fatalistic. Even the gods know they will eventually die during Ragnarok, the apocalyptic final battle. Imagine creating an entire religion where everybody, including divine beings, fully understands that disaster is unavoidable. Scandinavian optimism remained limited. Yet these myths also celebrated courage, loyalty, wit, and endurance against impossible odds, which makes sense for people living in environments where survival itself often felt uncertain. Over time, however, Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia. Kings converted partly for political reasons, trade relationships, and diplomatic advantages. Missionaries established churches. Pagan traditions blended gradually with Christian practices. And by the time of Leif Erikson, much of the Viking world was already Christianizing. In fact, according to some accounts, Leif himself converted to Christianity after visiting the court of Olaf Tryggvason, which created awkward tensions back home because Eric the Red reportedly disliked the new religion intensely. Another classic family disagreement. One son returns from abroad spiritually transformed while his father remains stubbornly committed to old traditions and possibly homicide. The sagas truly contain everything. And as we continue tonight, we'll drift farther into those sagas themselves. Because medieval Icelandic storytelling preserved not only voyages and discoveries, but ghosts, prophetic dreams, cursed families, doomed marriages, and some of the most passive-aggressive dialogue ever written. All delivered in the calm emotional tone of people trying very hard not to scream into the Arctic wind. So now we arrive at one of the strangest and most wonderful corners of medieval history, the Icelandic sagas. And honestly, if you have never read them before, imagine a combination of family drama, legal thriller, weather report, and extremely restrained emotional collapse. Because the sagas are fascinating precisely because they refuse to sound dramatic. Terrible things happen constantly. People lose fortunes. Families destroy each other. Ghosts appear. Farms burn down. Men are exiled into frozen wilderness after arguments involving livestock and wounded pride. And yet the narration remains almost aggressively calm. A man might discover that his entire household has been murdered and respond with the emotional energy of someone mildly disappointed by soup. Very Scandinavian literary behavior. Now the sagas were mostly written down in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, though many preserve older oral traditions from the Viking Age itself. And Iceland, strangely enough, became one of medieval Europe's great storytelling centers, which is slightly surprising considering Iceland was essentially a remote volcanic island full of sheep, lava, freezing wind, and emotionally exhausted farmers. But isolation creates storytellers. Long winters encourage memory. Families preserved histories carefully because genealogy mattered enormously in Norse society. People wanted to remember ancestors, property claims, alliances, feuds, and embarrassing incidents involving relatives. Especially embarrassing incidents. The sagas blended all these elements together. Some focused on kings and explorers. Others followed ordinary Icelandic families across generations of conflict and survival. Together, they create one of the richest literary windows into medieval life anywhere in Europe. And importantly for our story tonight, the Vinland sagas preserve knowledge of Viking voyages to North America centuries before archaeology confirmed them. Now, the two major Vinland texts are the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders. Annoyingly for historians, they do not fully agree with each other. Of course they do not. Medieval authors loved conflicting details almost as much as modern internet users enjoy arguing in comment sections. One saga emphasizes Leif Erikson more strongly. Another gives greater attention to other explorers like Thorfinn Karlsefni and Freydis Eriksdotter. And Freydis, honestly, may be one of the most intimidating figures in medieval literature. According to one saga account, during a violent confrontation in Vinland, Freydis allegedly frightened attackers away by grabbing a sword and exposing one breast while screaming at them, which is certainly memorable conflict resolution, and perhaps also evidence that medieval storytellers occasionally exaggerated for dramatic effect. Still, Freydis remains fascinating because saga women are often far more active and forceful than many people expect from medieval literature. Saga women give political advice, manipulate family alliances, encourage revenge, manage property, insult cowardly men, and occasionally terrify entire groups of enemies through sheer force of personality. Meanwhile, many male saga heroes spend enormous amounts of time silently staring into snow while emotionally malfunctioning. Again, very Scandinavian. Now, one reason the sagas feel so modern is their psychological realism. Characters behave like actual people, not idealized fantasy heroes. Real people, petty people, complicated people, people who ruin their own lives because somebody made a sarcastic remark 3 years earlier, and they still cannot emotionally recover from it. One of the greatest examples appears in Jarl's saga, often considered the masterpiece of Icelandic literature. This saga revolves around friendship, legal disputes, masculinity, revenge, and the slow catastrophic collapse of several interconnected families. And the tragedy unfolds with such astonishing inevitability that reading it feels like watching a glacier destroy a village in slow motion. Nobody can stop. Nobody can calm down. Every insult demands response. Every response creates new obligations. And before long, half the country is legally required to kill the other half over arguments nobody fully remembers anymore. Medieval Iceland truly needed therapy. Now these saga societies operated through complicated honor systems. Modern audiences sometimes misunderstand honor cultures as simple macho aggression, but they were actually deeply social systems built around reputation, trust, obligation, and public standing. In small, isolated communities, reputation mattered enormously. If people viewed you as weak, dishonest, or dishonorable, your survival could genuinely suffer. Trade relationships weakened. Allies disappeared. Marriage prospects collapsed. Enemies grew bolder. This helps explain why saga characters react so intensely to insults. What seems minor to modern readers could carry serious social consequences in medieval Iceland. Still, even accounting for that, some saga feuds become almost comically disproportionate. A man insults another man's beard. Someone throws cheese during dinner. A relative refuses an awkward marriage proposal. Suddenly 40 people are dead and 3 farms are on fire. Human beings remain consistent across centuries. Now, alongside feuds and lawsuits, the sagas preserve remarkable details about exploration and travel. The Norse world was astonishingly interconnected for its time. Vikings traveled not only westward to Greenland and Vinland, but eastward through river systems into what is now Russia and beyond. Norse traders reached Constantinople, where some even served in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard. Imagine being a medieval Scandinavian farmer's son and somehow ending up guarding the Emperor of Byzantium in one of the world's richest cities. History contains some extraordinary career changes. The Viking trade world connected Scandinavia with the Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, Western Europe, and the Arctic. Archaeologists have discovered Arabic silver coins in Scandinavian hoards, evidence of enormous trading networks spanning continents. Which means somewhere in medieval Norway, a fisherman might casually own coins originating thousands of miles away in the Islamic world. The medieval world was far more connected than people often imagine. Now, despite all this movement and exploration, most Vikings remained ordinary farmers. This is important. Popular culture often imagines entire Viking societies as non-stop raiding machines filled with muscular berserkers shouting continuously. In reality, most people spent their lives farming, fishing, raising livestock, weaving cloth, repairing buildings, and trying to survive winter. Raiders and explorers represented only part of society. And honestly, many Viking expeditions probably began because younger sons lacked inheritance opportunities at home. Scandinavia's geography limited farmland. Population pressures encouraged outward expansion. Some people sought wealth abroad because remaining home meant poverty. Others were exiles escaping legal punishment. Again, exile appears constantly in Norse history. If medieval Iceland had one primary governmental function, it was probably telling emotionally unstable men to leave the island for a few years and reconsider their choices. This system produced remarkable unintended consequences. Eric the Red gets exiled from Iceland and discovers Greenland. Others get exiled and join overseas expeditions. At times, Viking exploration feels less like organized imperial strategy and more like Scandinavia repeatedly ejecting difficult personalities into the Atlantic Ocean. And somehow continents kept appearing. Now let us drift briefly back toward Greenland again, because life there grew increasingly fragile during the centuries after Vinland exploration. The Greenland colonies remained culturally connected to Europe long after many people assumed they vanished into isolation completely. Churches operated there. European goods arrived intermittently. Written records mention bishops, trade voyages, and even political disputes involving Greenland settlers. One famous document from 1408 records a marriage held at Valsøy Church in Greenland. And there is something haunting about that record, because it is among the last clear written glimpses we have of the Norse Greenlanders before they disappear from history. Imagine attending a wedding at the edge of the Arctic world while your society slowly collapses around you. People still dancing, still exchanging vows, still trying to behave normally while trade routes weaken and winters grow harsher. Human beings are remarkably committed to routine even during decline. The ruins of Valsey Church still stand today in Greenland. Stone walls beneath cold northern skies. Quiet reminders that medieval Europeans once established communities there for centuries, and eventually lost them. Now historians continue debating exactly why the Greenland colonies vanished. Climate change certainly mattered. The Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures and more sea ice. Trade difficulties worsened isolation. Economic decline reduced incentives for European merchants to maintain risky voyages. Environmental strain damaged farming. Perhaps conflicts occurred with Inuit populations. Perhaps disease spread. Most likely several factors combined gradually over generations, which is often how civilizations actually decline. Not through one dramatic catastrophe, but through accumulating pressure. Small failures stacking slowly atop one another until societies become too fragile to recover. And throughout all this, the memory of Vinland faded into saga tradition. Europe entered later medieval centuries focused on entirely different concerns. Wars between kingdoms, religious conflicts, plagues, dynastic disasters. The usual medieval collection of misery. Nobody seriously attempted sustained colonization of North America again for centuries. And perhaps that long silence is part of what makes the Viking voyages feel so dreamlike. A brief moment around the year 1000 when Norse sailors crossed into another continent and then withdrew again into history, like a wave reaching shore before quietly pulling back into fog. Now eventually, centuries later, archaeology would rediscover physical evidence at Lance Aux Meadows and confirm what the sagas preserved. But before that happened, generations argued endlessly about whether the stories were true. Some scholars believed the voyages entirely historical. Others dismissed them as legend. Still others proposed elaborate theories placing Vinland almost everywhere except where it actually was, which historians tend to do whenever evidence becomes incomplete. And, honestly, fair enough. The sagas themselves can feel slippery and half-dreaming at times. Ghosts appear casually. Prophecies emerge. Magic and reality overlap. Characters receive ominous dreams about doom while everyone politely pretends not to notice. It creates a strange atmosphere where history and myth blend together like northern fog drifting across icy water. And perhaps that atmosphere perfectly suits the Viking discovery of America itself. Not a triumphant conquest. Not a grand empire. Just fragments. Ships in mist. Stories around fires. A few ruined buildings beside the Atlantic. And generations later, historians still trying to piece together exactly what happened at the edge of the medieval world. Now, as we continue tonight, we'll slowly drift toward the indigenous peoples the Vikings encountered in North America. Because while European history often centers Viking explorers themselves, the Americas were already full of complex societies long before Norse ships appeared offshore. And those encounters, brief as they were, shaped the limits of Viking expansion more than any saga hero probably cared to admit.